Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to all who are present for the webinar today. I'm Smita Apte, your host for the afternoon. I do hope everyone has been doing well in these tough, challenging, and unprecedented times, where all of us have learned to adapt to new ways of moving ahead with what otherwise looked like mundane everyday routine. Technology has never been so important and so relevant as it is today. It has really come to our rescue in the recent times, be it at work, personal interactions, hospital operations, or academic learnings. And when we are on the topic of learning, we cannot really ignore assessments. While there have been significant set of innovations in technology-enabled assessments over the past few years, the pandemic has pushed both the assessment bodies as well as the suppliers to evaluate alternate mechanisms for conducting e-assessments without compromising on the key aspects of security and reliability. So we would be spending the next 45 to 50 minutes discussing on exactly these areas to see how we can fit the year. Got a Matt, Chairman of EAssessment Association, who would be setting the context for the webinar today on remote delivery of assessments, followed by Graham, Secretary to the EAssessment Association, who would talk about the key considerations while we are moving to remote proctoring. And finally, we have Nikhil from TCS Ion sharing some details on the TCS Ion platform and how they have gone ahead helping organizations to move to remote assessments. While I see most of you would have attended virtual events in the last 4 months, I thought a few quick tips would definitely help to make the experience today as smooth as possible for all of us. We would want you to participate and get involved in the discussion today, so I would encourage you to keep posting your questions in the comment section. We will visit as many questions as possible in the Q&A session, for which we have allotted some time at the end. A copy of today's presentation would be made available post this session. And since this is happening online and the speakers joining in from different parts of the country today, there may be some technical problems, maybe a bit of a lag or occasional screen freeze. So please bear with us. We will do our best to ensure that these disruptions are minimal and we move ahead smoothly with the session today. Okay, so let's get started. Our first speaker for the day is Matt Wingfield, the EAssessment Association Chairman. With over 29 years of experience within the education market as a teacher and working in various roles for technology providers, Matt has built up a significant understanding on the issues relating to the use of e-assessment within the education segment itself. Until recently, Matt was the Chief Business Development Officer for leading evidence-based assessment technology provider Digital Assess, a role that has seen him work closely with a number of leading assessment providers and awarding organizations. Matt now works as an independent consultant within the education technology sector, supporting technology providers with market strategy development, and both the awarding bodies and educators in maximizing the positive impact of technology on assessment delivery. Today, I think he would be sharing with us his experience on how COVID-19 has played the role of a catalyst to bring about large changes in the e-assessment space. So over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Smita, for that wonderful introduction. And hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. And I hope you enjoy these next 45 minutes or so as we go through some of the areas around remote assessment and how technology can help with that. I thought what we would do to start with is just have a little bit of a context setting around the use of e-assessment in general. And as Smita was saying, specifically looking at some of the examples where organizations have pivoted their assessment delivery from a physical pen and paper kind of model into an e-assessment stroke remote assessment delivery model. So So if I can have my slides on the screen, I will take you through some examples. So the first thing to point out, I suppose, is that I'm speaking on behalf of the EAssessment Association. Some of you may not have come across the association previously. We're relatively young. We've been around since 2008 and have built up quite a following now across all sectors of the education sector. We've got nearly 2,000 members. We're all about promoting best practice in the use of e-assessment technologies and helping people to understand how to maximize the use of the technologies to support assessment delivery, which is particularly pertinent in the times that we've been living through in the last few months, where we've needed to pivot our assessment delivery models to be more flexible to meet the demands of the pandemic and the restrictions of the pandemic. So the association's really been heavily involved in supporting organisations through this difficult period, and generally speaking is all about, as I say, promoting best practice and helping people understand how to maximise the use of assessment technologies. I think it's also worth pointing out we're the only professional body which supports all areas of e-assessment use. Often when people talk about e-assessment, they immediately think about on-screen testing, but e-assessment is a much broader church than that, encompassing formative and summative assessment models, the use of e-portfolios, virtual reality, all sorts of technologies that help support the assessment process. And the association is about promoting all of that and helping people, as I say, understand how to maximise its impact. So that's the association, or a little bit about it. I think that the last thing I wanted to say is, if you're not already a member of the association and you're interested in remote assessments, e-assessments in general, then do join us. It's completely free to become a member, and you can join up. It only takes a couple of minutes by visiting the website shown at the bottom of the screen there, e-assessment.com. There's a very simple form to fill in to become a member. So if you're not a member, do consider joining us and becoming part of this professional body of people who are interested in the use of e-assessment. So that's the EAA. Let's move on to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of e-assessment technologies before we look at some specific examples of how people have benefited from pivoting their assessment models to a digital delivery. There's no doubt that in the last few years, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been some seismic changes in the use of technology to support assessment, whether that's in summative assessment delivery or formative assessment delivery, so that sort of ongoing supporting model of supporting the learning practice. Really great examples of how artificial intelligence are being used to support assessment delivery, computer-aided and computer adaptive testing in supporting that learning and assessment process, remote invigilation / remote proctoring. I'm sure Graham will talk a little bit more about the difference between those two terms shortly, but basically supporting remote monitoring of assessment delivery. There's been a huge spike in that. As I say, over the last couple of years, the interest in these areas has grown significantly, but obviously has been accelerated specifically as the pandemic has taken hold and forced us to think about different ways of delivering assessment. So that's some of the background about the kinds of innovation within e-assessment that we're seeing. But all of that's great, but it has to have a benefit. So what I wanted to do very quickly was just look at some of those key benefits of using e-assessment technologies, because there really are significant positive impacts on the assessment delivery process. I think for awarding organisations and centres, training centres and educational institutions, that the benefits are really around operational delivery. So particularly pertinent, that first point there around greater resilience, particularly pertinent in light of the last few months and our experience, being able to quickly adapt to different delivery models, whether that's moving from a classroom or an exam hall based use of technology delivery to a remote model where you're supporting learners disparately, or whether that's upscaling remote assessment so that it's being used by more students. The technology really helps support that flexibility in moving, which sort of leads on to the second point there, which is about being faster and more nimble, if you like, both in terms of the delivery, but also in terms of delivering the results to the learners. It's an important factor because I think, you know, more than ever, students are thinking of themselves as consumers, and we need to make sure that they get the results that they deserve as quickly as possible. And when we're faced with constrained assessment delivery issues, whether that's relating to a pandemic or other constraining issues, the faster we can turn around the results, the more time we have to make sure that the assessment delivery is correct and in place. And we'll come back to that point a little bit later on in the presentation. So allowing more flexibility in both delivery and in terms of the results, getting to the right people is important, and allows you as awarding organisations or as institutions to deliver more nimbly to your markets. I think the other key point is around insight into progression of the learner. So whether it's being used from a formative perspective or a purely summative perspective over a period of time, the whole idea about getting better insight into the performance of the learner is something that technology can really help with. And there are some fantastic examples at the moment in the market where technology is giving teachers greater insight into where students need more help in order to progress their skills to a greater level of competence. Really, really important, and a really great benefit of using technology, because it's something that's so much easier to do in a digital context than it is in a pen and paper context. I think the last point there is it does also have potential to save some money, perhaps not in the short term because there's the investment of setting it all up, but once you get the operation smoothly running, then there is an opportunity to save on costs and reduce the amount of time and effort that's been put into the delivery of the assessment and the dissemination of results. And all of that, of course, feeds into providing competitive advantage. But of course, awarding bodies and institutions, as important as they are not the only people involved in the process. And a significant benefit, I think, or part of the benefit of using technology, is around the candidates. So it improves student experience. This is something that is becoming increasingly important. I think it's being noticed most in the further education and higher education world, where the student as a consumer is becoming a more important and prevalent thing. But improving the student experience has got to be paramount. We want to make sure that they not necessarily enjoy the assessment, but that they feel that they're getting best value from the assessment that they're taking part in. The technology also allows candidates to be able to take assessments when they're ready to do so, rather than having to be reliant on sitting in fixed windows. They can actually be assessed when they're ready to do so, which I think is a big benefit to the candidates and also to the centres, because it allows them to deliver a more flexible assessment model. There's also greater security around making sure that bits of paper don't go missing because it's all digitised and we know where it is. I think it's also, as a digital process, less daunting and more intuitive for many learners. There are, of course, exceptions to that, but for the vast majority of learners, it's what they're used to. And I think it also helps them understand more about their own progression, because again, in the same way that teachers get better access to data, so do the learners. They can understand the path they're on. They can understand when they're getting ready to be assessed, and thus increasing their assessment literacy. So all of those benefits combine to make, I think, a digital assessment proposition very attractive for all the key stakeholders involved in the process. So those are some of the reasons why you might want to consider it if you're not already doing it. Let's talk a little bit about how things like a pandemic and other challenges can help catalyse some of the change in these areas. And before we talk specifically about what we've just been living through in the last few months, I wanted to reflect back on something that happened back in 2003. Because in 2003, there was a very similar pandemic that hit particularly the Far East, the SARS outbreak, which prompted a lot of educational institutions to make themselves more prepared in the way that they delivered their teaching and learning and assessment, and introduce greater resilience in it. And there's an example there from the Singapore Management University, where tutors, as a normal way of their training and their everyday professional development, have to take part in training courses around delivering their lectures and their lessons online, so that if there is a reason why students can't come into the university, as we've seen just recently, they can pivot very quickly. And that, of course, has benefits. And the benefits are, when you do come to talk about what's happened in the last few months, people in these regions, particularly in Asia, have been able to pivot their delivery significantly more quickly because they were ready for it. They'd lived through a similar piece, they developed processes and plans to make sure that they could pivot quickly. So thinking specifically about the Singapore Management University, they pivoted 1,000 courses with less than 12 hours notice to pure online delivery. And that was, I was going to say simple, probably not simple for them to do, but easier for them to do because they were ready, because they understood the processes that they needed to go through. And more importantly, they had a plan in place. And I think if there's one piece of learning that we should all take away from what we've lived through in the last few months, is that we need a plan. We need a contingency plan in place that will allow us to continue with business as usual, as near as possible, in terms of teaching and learning and assessment. I think one of the interesting little snippets that I've picked up on in the last few weeks is what Microsoft have seen in the last few months. So Microsoft say that they've seen 2 years of digital transformation in just 2 months, which is a really significant step. I think a lot of that's been driven by people using collaborative tools like Microsoft Teams to work together, whether that's in terms of commerce or whether that's in terms of education and supporting learning. But there's been a significant step change there. And I think the more prepared we can be for doing that, the greater the potential and benefit of being able to pivot quickly. And one little quote there from someone, a good friend of mine called Bob Harrison, who's an education advisor and a chair of the Board of Governors for an FE college, talking about the slight frustration in his mind about having spent so long trying to persuade everybody that digital was the way to go for a long period of time, and then a virus comes along and makes everyone see that in a very short space of time. Frustrating, but also good, because it allows people to understand some of the benefits and be able to reap those benefits. So I promised to talk about some examples of where some change has already been driven through the recent pandemic. So let's talk about these very quickly, but give you an idea. Just a few examples that I'm aware of. University of London, this is perhaps the biggest example I've come across, where they've got a cohort of 40,000 students. They've shifted a significant number of assessments to a digital assessment delivery model from a purely pen and paper model previously. Now, they already had this in the roadmap. It was a 2 to 3 year plan, but they had to quickly enact it, and they managed to get it in place within a couple of months, including a significant number of students being remotely invigilated, which again, as I say, Graham will talk a little bit more about in his presentation. Brunel University in London, slightly smaller cohort, but they migrated to an open book assessment model. Now, this has been quite an interesting and common model in a lot of the universities in the way that they've changed their assessment delivery over the last few months. So rather than students coming in and having to sit with no links to the outside world in an exam hall, they're being allowed to take the assessments at home, sometimes not necessarily at their own pace, but certainly with access to a wider range of resources than they would do normally. And thus the assessments themselves have been changed so that that is possible, so that the questions are asking for information that isn't necessarily just about information recall. It's about interacting with the information that the student's finding elsewhere and delivering a response that shows that they understand the information and can apply it. And then the Open University, which has a significant student cohort, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, they decided to shift to a model where they said, well, we're not going to carry out all of the assessments that we planned to carry out as normal. We're going to focus in on the most critical ones and shift those to a digital delivery model. And the net result of that was a continuous progression for those students who absolutely needed to be assessed, but also a less stressful scenario for lots of students, because the university also took into account some of the coursework-based assessments that they'd done through the year. So rather than just emphasizing everything on one summative performance at a certain time, they were looking at a wider set of indicators around the performance of the students. The last example I wanted to talk to you about was from the awarding body world. Many of you will be aware and familiar with City and Guilds as a leading UK awarding organisation in the vocational space with presence around the world. They had a significant challenge when the pandemic hit. They have lots of students wanting to sit assessments, and they had what their managing director describes as a seismic shift to using online tools. They not only saw significant increase in the use of their online training materials, so growing, as it says there, from 10,000 users per month to 60,000 users per month on average, but they also started to roll out technologies to allow the assessments to take place as they would do normally, but through a digital remote assessment model. So rolling out remote invigilation to over 200 centres, and then building in a now standard model for remote discussions and observations as part of their apprenticeships models and other qualifications. And they've also significantly ramped up their use of digital certification. So rather than relying on paper certificates, which of course someone has to go into an office to print out, which can be difficult in times of constraint, as we've just been through, using digital certifications so that that's not necessary, and the certificates can be distributed to students in a time-sensitive way. So those are a few examples, hopefully helpful examples of how some of the institutions and organisations have pivoted their assessment models to be more digitally and remote focused. But I think in all of this change, it's important that we keep a clear view of what it is we're trying to achieve. And I'm going to give you a slightly light-hearted example here. So some of you will have heard the story of back in the 60s when NASA was in the space race with the Soviet Union. They suddenly realized that traditional pens wouldn't work in space because traditional pens rely on gravity. And so they invested significant amounts of money in creating a space pen, one that could work regardless of whether gravity was present or not. So this, so we're told, was the US approach to solving the problem. The Russians, so we're told, their solution to the problem was a space pencil, which of course doesn't rely on gravity and cost them much, much less to develop. Now, actually, this story is a myth. It's not reality. And there was a space pen developed, but someone else funded it, and it was used by both space programs. The reason I mention it, though, is that it's a really good example of not throwing money at something without a clear understanding of what it is that you want to achieve, making sure that those requirements, in our case around assessment, are still hold true in the new world and the new models that you want to use. And for that reason, I wanted to briefly touch on a couple of things that JISC have done recently, which I think some of you will find helpful in terms of making sure that you keep those requirements of assessment clearly in your mind. The first is a little quote there from JISC in a publication, an article that they published in last month, in June, making sure that when you're changing the assessment to match the future requirements, you're not losing sight of the fact that the context of that future needs to be relevant to the student in that future context and not in the past. And that's a really interesting salutary point for us, because much of our assessment models are based on 19th century, early 20th century practice, and we need to modernize those, and technology can help us do that. And I think JISC are rightly pointing out that we need to be conscious about where we want our students to go. The contexts and the environment in which they're going to work need to be relevant and borne in mind when we're making up the assessments of the future. And to that end, just before the pandemic hit in March, they published a report which I think is really worth a read, which lays out 5 pillars or 5 principles of good assessment practice, which people should keep in mind as they start to move assessments forward and use technology more and more. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because I'm conscious of time, but I'll give you a link to the full report if you want to read it as well, so that you can delve into it in a bit more detail. But their view is that the 5 pillars, the 5 principles that we need to keep clearly in mind are authenticity. We need to make sure, and this goes back to the point I was just making, that the assessment is fit for purpose in terms of the kind of jobs, the kind of skills that we're trying to test, both now and in the future for our students. So we've got to make sure that we're using the technology to keep the assessments authentic. We need to make sure that we're using technology to help with the accessibility of the assessments. Now, this is an area where technology can really help. And if you look at a great project that's taking place in Wales at the moment, where the national tests across all of the Welsh schools are being delivered on screen through computer adaptive testing, the special requirements for students with special needs has dropped dramatically. The number of large print papers that the government is needing to produce has dropped almost to zero, because we can get so much more accessibility into the assessment built into the technology that we're using to deliver it when it's on screen. It needs to utilize appropriate technology to automate it. And that's really, I suppose, focusing in on teacher and marker workload, making sure that we're using technology to reduce that as far as we can, because we know our teachers and markers have extreme workloads already. We don't want to add to that with the technology. We want to help. We want to remove some of that workload by automating some of the assessments. So if assessments involve multiple choice questions, there are technologies out there now that will allow you to automatically mark those. We still need humans involved when there are longer written responses, although technology is starting to be developed that will enable that to be automatically marked, or at least suggested in terms of the automatic marking in the future. But we need to use technology to help us to reduce that workload. We need to start to embrace more continuous assessment models. Now, I think this is so pertinent for the last few months that we've just been through. If we had more continuous assessment models, we'd be less reliant on a single performance assessment window at the end. And we should start to embrace technology. There doesn't have to be significant changes. We just need to look at ways in which we can assess progression of students more often without it becoming burdensome to the student, to give us a view, both as a teacher and as a student, on the direction of travel, to make sure that we're going in the right direction. So something does happen that prevents us having the summative assessment window that we were expecting, we're not left grappling around in the dark, because we've already got a sense of where the student goes. And I really feel very strongly about this, and I think it's great that JISC has highlighted this as a way of helping build more resilience into our assessment models. And the last point that they make is about making sure that we're using technology to ensure that the assessments are secure. And technology can be really helpful in this respect. I mean, lots of people say, you know, the pen and paper, you can't get more secure than that because it's difficult for malpractice to creep in. Well, of course, pen and paper doesn't take away the fact that pieces of paper can get lost. It doesn't get around the fact that question papers can be shared before the exam. All of those areas and more can be helped with technology to make the assessment more secure, more auditable, more traceable in terms of malpractice. So having inbuilt security is a great strength of assessment. And again, it's great to see that as one of JISC's recommendations. If you want to find out more about the JISC report, the link's there on the screen. Please do take a read. It's not a long report, and it's a great thing to take on board as part of your plans for your future development of assessment. The last part of the presentation is just looking specifically at next year. Now, in the UK, as is true in other parts of the world, we have an exam regulator called Ofqual, in this case, who focus on the English exam market. In the UK, we have 4 regulators, as I'm sure many of you will be aware. Ofqual focus just on England. And they've been thinking, as many of the other regulators have, around what sort of guidance they can give to centres and institutions around how they deliver their high stakes assessments in 2021, so that we can try and avoid the impasse that we had this year when we weren't able to undertake the normal summative assessment windows as had been planned. So they've just launched a consultation piece. I say actually just launched, they launched it a few weeks ago. It closed last week. We'll be waiting to see the results of that consultation in August. They proposed 4 ways of changing the assessment model in 2021. I'm not planning on going into this in huge amounts of detail, and again, I'll provide a link at the end of this to the full piece, so you can delve into it in more detail if you want. But what they're proposing is 4 ways basically to try and make the assessments more flexible. So trimming the assessment focuses in some subjects to free up teachers' time, so that the teachers don't have to spend so much time focused on such a broad range of assessments across all subjects. Obviously, they're not suggesting this for some of the core subjects, the English, maths and sciences, but for some of the other subjects, trying to reduce some of the teaching time that's required for the assessments is one way of increasing teachers' time, so that you can spread the teaching time over a greater period of time, again, in case of disruption. They're wanting to also suggest some adaptations to some of the assessments. So, for example, in performing arts, rather than insisting that students perform as a quartet of students, they're suggesting that students can undertake their assessments as solos or as pairs, to make it easier for centres to be able to deliver the assessments. So changing and adjusting some of the assessments so that the hurdles aren't so great in case there's further disruption next year. They're talking about content sampling in some questions, so that you are able to mix and match a little bit of some of the courses that students are needing to study, again, to lessen the workload for both the students and the teachers in case of disruption. And they're also talking about pushing back when the exams take place to later in the summer term, so that there's more time to compensate for any disruption to teaching time, rather than facing the brick wall much closer and not being able to have time to come up with contingencies for that. So that's what they're proposing for our high stakes school leaving exams, our GCSEs, which are our 16-year-old school leaving exams, and our A-levels, which are our 18-year-old school leaving exams in England. They've also made some suggestions around vocational qualifications. Here they're one step further ahead with this. They ran a consultation earlier in the year. They've now put out a positioning paper for people to feed back on. This is live at the moment, and again, I'll provide you a link to this so that you can delve into it in more detail. They're suggesting very similar approaches here, although vocational is slightly different. And so, for example, removing some of the content or mandatory content from some vocational subjects is harder, because a lot of those vocational qualifications are competency based, and you need to know that the student has achieved all of that learning in order to be competent in the job that they're going into. But at its heart, it's all about introducing more flexibility into the assessment models. So, for example, introducing greater use of bankable assessment modules, so allowing students, again, a bit like the JISC model around continuous assessment, rather than all of the assessment happening at the end, students are able to take modular assessment all the way through the year, bank the results of those, so that if some units can't be taken because of further disruption, then you're not faced with such a steep hill to climb in terms of catching up. Some really sensible options here. But just to close, and a parting thought, these are great, and they're great ways of ensuring that the assessment process has greater flexibility to cope with potential disruption. But do they really go far enough, is my question, because actually, as we saw in some of the proposals from JISC, you can bake in far greater resilience by the use of technology. And actually, if we had our regulators being more vocal around supporting the use of technology, supporting the use of remote assessment as an option, as long as all of the bits are in place to make sure that that's being done properly and that malpractice is being minimized, actually that's going to add to the resilience of the overall assessment piece. And it's exactly what people like the University of London, Brunel, and the Open University and Sitting Guilds and many others have done to adapt their assessment models in 2020. And I'd like to see more of that, and a more fundamental push to the use of technology to do that, because the technology's there, it's proven, it works at scale, and it introduces that resilience in a very sound way. If you want to find out more about what Ofqual in particular has been suggesting, the link is there on the bottom of the slide. That's me. Apologies, I've gone on a little bit longer than I was meant to, but I hope that's been helpful. Thank you very much. And if you have got questions for me at the end, then I'm happy to do that in the Q&A session at the end. But for now, back to Smita.
Thank you, Matt. I think that was very insightful, especially to see how some of the institutions and organizations have pivoted their assessments to be more digital and remote, given the current situation. Okay, so we will now move on to our next speaker, Graham Hudson, Secretary to the EAssessment Association. Graham is a long-standing member of the educational assessment community, having worked in the sector for over 30 years. He has been involved in many of the significant developments in general qualifications, including introduction to the GCSEs, Curriculum 2000, and the national curriculum at Key Stage 4. Graham now runs his own consultancy business supporting organizations in the assessment sector. I would like to now call upon him to take a quick look at what are some of the key considerations when it comes to remote proctoring, and how does one really go about selecting the right supplier. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Smita. That's very good of you. And I was reflecting actually on the path that I've taken over the last 20 years or so. I got more interested in digital assessments and all that side of things when I worked at QCA and gained some government funding to look at how it could be applied. And I'm somewhat horrified to think that was nearly 20 years ago. And the path that I've taken since then has mostly focused on how you implement new elements of technology, and I'm going to focus on that today, not necessarily on the technical aspects of remote proctoring, which I know Nicola is going to talk about a little bit later, but some of the business considerations that you might like to take into account. So Nina, if you could pop my slides up, that would be great. Thanks very much. So as Smita said, I work currently in supporting organizations that want to make digital transformation and change. I've done quite a bit recently on helping organizations procure new services, remote proctoring being part of that. So let's just have a look at the topics I want to cover. I'm just going to talk about what actually is and the terminology, as Matt indicated earlier on, why you might want to use it, the types of service that there are available, what you want to take into account when you consider what options to choose, and then just a little bit about the topic that's quite close to my heart, finding the right supplier. So remote proctoring, or remote invigilation as it's called, what does that look like? So proctoring tends to be the US type of terminology. Invigilation it tends to be what's more used in the UK, Europe, and elsewhere. Essentially, you're trying to recreate what goes on in the test center or examination hall. So if you imagine your candidate's journey into the test center or examination hall, as they enter, they're going to be checked off by the invigilator. There will most likely be some sort of validation or identity check that the person who turns up is the person that they say they are. They'll be shown to a place where it's appropriate for them to take the exam. It's set out correctly and it's free of distractions. There'll be a check to make sure that they don't have any materials with them that would give them an unfair advantage over other candidates. Potentially technology that is barred from the exam, be it mobile phones or smartwatches or any other elements of that sort. And once the exam is underway, the invigilator or invigilators will be checking through the whole process exactly what's going on and whether or not candidates are adhering to the rules that they're meant to be, and also picking up on any process type questions that candidates might have. Clearly not helping them with the exam questions, but anything about the functioning of the exam itself. And essentially that's what happens in a remote environment, except that you're doing it through the use of the technology that the candidate has. So the candidate needs what they need to take an online test, which is a PC and an internet connection. They actually need a little bit more than that, which we'll talk about in just a moment, but the whole remote invigilation or proctoring exercise covers the same principles. So a proctor will check the validation and identity of the learner or candidate taking the test. And there are various mechanisms for doing that, looking at passports, identity cards, driving licenses, and other things, and how that can be validated in relation to the individual themselves. Then the environment in which the candidate's operating is checked. It's checked that it's clearly suitable for the candidate, that they're not going to be disturbed, that there's nobody else in the room with them. And normally there'll be a sweep of the room with the candidate's camera from their computer to ensure that there isn't any information available to them that's out of sight of the proctor that might give them some advantage. And a check for technology, that's all switched off and out the way. And then as the exam progresses, it will be monitored. And there are different ways of doing that, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And of course, one of the clear advantages about taking your exams remotely and setting the right environment is that candidates are likely to be more at ease in their own place. And also they don't have to travel. Now, I happen to be a member of the assessment committee of the Institute of Directors, have been for the last 3 years or so, and we oversee the operation of the professional examinations that the Institute operates. And for the last 3 years, we've been operating remotely and through remote proctoring. And I have had instances of having to review what candidates have done through the proctoring system to see whether or not they have been gaining an unfair advantage. And I can say that that works extremely well and has enabled us to make decisions about the acceptability of the candidates' answers and whether or not they should be awarded a grade. So what technology is needed? It's really not terribly complex. A quiet location, a tidy environment, standard desktop or laptop, the addition of a webcam and microphone, which is the type of kit that we're just using now and have been using pretty ubiquitously during the whole of lockdown, and an internet connection that's robust enough to deal with the online testing platform and also the remote proctoring. About 0.5 megabyte a second is what is normal in terms of remote proctoring take-up. So what's been quite interesting for me is that element of take-up over the last few months. Matt referred to it in terms of online testing. And I've been talking with a number of suppliers myself, and in talking with one, their regular run rate before lockdown was about 15,000 proctored tests a week. That rose pretty rapidly to 80,000 proctored tests a week. Another supplier I was talking to said that they had a month-on-month increase in their workload of 100%. It's been quite astonishing, the level of uptake in terms of this technology. So why might you use it? Well, rather than just thinking about the technical elements, I've thought about 3 factors that you might like to take into account. First is your business drivers. So as Matt said earlier on in his talk, the what and the why are actually quite important decisions to make in terms of using technologies such as this. So what is your market reach in terms of an organization? Is it fairly localized or regionalized, or are you spread across different territories as some of the professional bodies have? That's all going to have an impact on the decision making in terms of what approach you want to take in running your exams. As well as that, your competitive positioning. So you might find that in a similar market, your competitors are beginning to look at delivering assessments not just online in testing centers, but using remote proctoring and invigilation. So consider those elements. What does it mean in terms of your business, continuation of revenue, return on the investment that you're going to be making? The other category is operational drivers. What delivery model do you have? Do you have approved learning providers or approved test centers where candidates go to learn and take their assessments? Are you looking to deliver in the same way but using a remote proctoring environment as opposed to a live proctoring environment? What partners do you have? Do they have the appropriate facilities, wherewithal, infrastructure to actually start to implement change with you? And is it part of the business model for learning organizations? So many professional bodies will work with associated learning organizations who deliver their courses and then on the end of the course offer the exam. So what will be the implications for them? So that whole operational bit about what your existing processes are, what your new processes might be, and the implications for change. And then finally, your assessments and what I call the nature and value in the market. So whether they're summative or formative or high stakes or low stakes, that's going to color your view about the importance of the level of security and guarding against any malpractice that you may want to take. So types of service. The three things that sprang to mind immediately for me was budget. I'm sure that's important for everybody when they're considering a move such as this. How does that impact upon the current pricing of services that you have? Is the investment that you make likely to be a one-off capital or change investment? Is there going to be an ongoing impact upon the rates of how you offer your exams, and in particular how that's positioned with your delivery providers? Again, what does that mean in terms of your competitive positioning and the impact upon your different partners in different locations? So depending on your choice of proctoring, you're going to pay a different level of fee. And just to give you some idea of the difference between one sort or another, the price differential can be around 5 or 6 times from the most basic service to the most sophisticated service. And I'll talk a little bit more about that now as we move on to categories of service. So broadly speaking, they fall into 2 categories, what we call real-time proctoring or invigilation, or recorded invigilation. So the real-time has an invigilator present all the way through the candidate's test, through remote access of the camera and seeing what the candidate is doing. They can intervene, and in some cases they might do so. They could stop a candidate taking an exam, or they could intervene and warn a candidate about some behaviors that they see that are perhaps not appropriate. And they can also make a note of anything and bring that up subsequently with the awarding organization or professional body. The recorded approach is just that. Everything is recorded. All the interactions are recorded and reviewed subsequently. And that can be done at different levels of service, which brings me on to my next point about outsourcing invigilation or not. So my own thesis in this area, and it has been one of my business principles for a long time, and that's basically stick doing what you do best. And most awarding organizations and professional bodies provide content and do that well, and provide assessments and do that well. They're probably not as well versed in the intricacies of using a remote proctoring or invigilation system and looking at when candidates are displaying behaviors that are not good in that context. So I would personally on the side of outsourcing that in terms of the live invigilation and the record and the reviewing of it. So I mentioned the lowest level of service in my earlier comment. The lowest level of service would be a recorded service which you review yourselves in the awarding organization or professional body. The next tier would be the same thing, but it's used and reviewed by the proctoring organization. And the top tier of the service is a proctoring organization that supplies the proctors, does the reviewing of the exam and provides you with an outcome. And then the use of artificial intelligence or not. Now, largely this is used in a recorded environment because it's used to detect behaviors which are not normal. Now, that could be, depending on the level of sophistication, facial recognition, expressions of candidates, how they move their head, their eyes, whether they are consistently doing a particular movement. So they may be looking down at something over here regularly, and that sort of movement can be detected. In some cases, the way in which they use the keyboard can be monitored. And that is all part of the decision making of which candidates subsequently to look at to see whether there is any risk of malpractice taking place. And generally speaking, the threshold of where that risk is placed is a discussion between the proctoring organisation and the organisation using the service. And those that trip over that threshold are the ones that get flagged up and then will be reviewed by those who provided the test and are measuring the content and can make the best decisions. So essentially what I'm saying here, think about what's the best fit for your services and for your purposes, and that's going to be largely based upon your determination of risk in relation to the qualifications, certifications and testing that you're going to be deploying. So what do you need to take into account when you're thinking about a remote proctoring or invigilation service? Well, clearly functionality. What's the interface design like? Language translation. So I'm doing a piece of work at the moment where we've talked to test providers and they've said Spanish, French, German, Mandarin, English are probably at the moment the 5 top languages that they would see as being important. So can the proctoring system be delivered in those native languages? And if you're using a live proctor, can the invigilator speak to candidates in their native languages? So think about those things in terms of how you want things to be done and what the outcome is you want. Then where is the service taking place? Is it taking place within a jurisdiction that you're happy with? A European jurisdiction, a UK jurisdiction, maybe North American jurisdiction, or possibly Far East? That has a bearing on the availability of the service and also the availability of the support and where that's located. And the technology used for the learner, the candidate, also for partners, how can it deliver in locations of varying infrastructure? So some systems will do a continuous recording of video, some will do periodic photographing of candidates on a frequency that's determined as part of the service. So that might be a snap every 10 seconds, for example. Those things have a bearing on your internet connection, the bandwidth that's available. So consider how that's going to be used and the use of what type of use of artificial intelligence is put into place. And then lastly, this is really a very important area, the security and information handling. So this is not just about the security of the tests, it's about the whole security that surrounds this. So what are the GDPR implications in the jurisdiction in which you operate, or in the jurisdiction in which your learners or candidates are going to be taking their assessments? The use of biometrics. There are some areas of delivery that have local legislation that rules out the use of biometrics. So thinking about that as part of your decision making is quite important. Consent requirements. What level of consent are you going to have from those participating? Is it an implied level of consent, or is it an explicit level of consent? Is it a level of consent for actually the process or the recording or the people who are going to take part in reviewing the candidate's work? And retention of recordings as well. How long are they going to be kept? There have been some recent court cases in this respect, and some of you may have read about the University of Amsterdam, where they put in place remote invigilation. The students commented and objected to some of the requirements that were being explained. The university changed them made some commitments that only their tutor would be looking at the recording, that recordings would only be kept for 21 days, and other what we might think of as reasonable rules around this. The students, however, were not happy and took the university to court. And the ruling in the Dutch courts was that the university had taken all reasonable precautions and that it was perfectly legitimate for this to go ahead. But that's not to say that that ruling is applicable elsewhere in the world. You need to be clear about that in terms of your own environment. And then finally, the bit that is close to my heart is choosing a supplier. Just to say, have a good process in place. Make sure you have good dialogue between you and the suppliers. Don't feel that you have to be bound by, you have to do it this way, unless you're within an environment where you have to use European journal processes. Be clear about your why and your what. Don't try and document all sorts of numerous requirements, but just decide on the outcomes that you want and the success criteria that you want to see. And then involve suppliers in that dialogue who are going to be good at finding out why and what, and ask you really good questions. They can then go away and propose the how. And for me, most importantly, make sure that there's a good cultural fit between the people that you choose and your organization. So thank you very much. I hope you found that helpful, and happy to take questions, or if you want to get in touch with me subsequently, there's my details.
Thank you, Graham, for that amazing presentation. And I'm sure our listeners will have significantly benefited from it. Moving to Nikhil Sharma, he's been with TCS ION for nearly 10 years now and is currently focusing on business development for the TCS ION platform products in the UK and Europe geography. Today, he will walk us through some of these platforms with a specific focus on assessments and remote proctoring. Over to you, Nikhil.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Smita, and thanks to all of you for joining this webinar today. I'm sure you would have got a lot of insights hearing to Matt first and then Graham. A lot of very important insights for me also. So before we start, I would, I hope that you, your family, your colleagues, everyone are staying safe and positive during these unprecedented times. And I'll just for a slide you can bring. So Nina, can you please bring up my slide? Perfect. So I think all of you can see my slides now. And okay, so before I start, as Smita mentioned, I take care of business development for education-focused unit of TCS in UK, which is called as TCS ION. And I have been part of this unit since the last 10 years, and I've been based out of London, UK for the last 4 years. If we talk about TCS itself, it has been in UK for more than 30 years now, and it operates with more than 17,000 employees here in UK across 60 different locations. Our employee strength, one important thing is that it represents 50 different nationalities. And we are the first IT company in UK which has more than 35% women workforce. And if I talk specifically about TCS ION, these are the specific sectors in which we operate, which is basically government sector, K-12 sector, higher education sector, the skills and professional bodies, and even we have certain set of solutions which we have created for corporates. One important thing, to mention is, the values and the core principles for TCS Ion. They're very much aligned to, the 5 pillars which Matt was mentioning, which just came out with, and which will be very important to roll out till 2025. He talked about authenticity, accessibility, and if I combine both of them together, we call it as experience, or superior experience for student as well as all the other stakeholders who are using this technology. Matt talked about security, and we believe that security definitely is the most important thing when we talk about assessments, may it be internet based assessments, pen paper based, any kind of assessments. Security defines your brand value, it defines the trust which all the stakeholders have on you. And we also, heard from Matt as well as Graham, a lot of educational institutions like University of London, Brunel University, who have, moved their focus to remote invigilation to continue their assessments. And to do so, quickly, speed and scalability, they are very much required and very much important to do so. So considering these particular, core values, TCS Ion is focused on 3 different areas, which is particularly assessments, learning, and certain business operations. In space of assessments, we have come up with a set of digital assessment solution to conduct, computer-based testing offline as well as online. For pen and paper-based examinations, we have come up with certain softwares to mark the subjective responses. Over and above this, TCS Ion also provides the other important layers to conduct end-to-end assessments, which are basically infrastructure, or the people required. So from infrastructure perspective, we today own more than 250 plus centers, but through partners or through partnership with different center providers, today you can see that we have more than 6,500 unique exam centers where we conduct our examinations, which are located across more than 230 plus international countries. And talking about numbers, we have done more than 210 million assessments through our platforms. And these assessments, these are from high stake, low stake, any kind of recruitment examinations, competitive examinations for getting entry into schools or colleges. So all kind of assessments. And as I mentioned, we do assessments with internet, without internet. If you want to run certain examinations in computer-based mode, in a fully offline mode, that is also which we do. We do it in LAN-based mode also, where you can run assessments in centers. If there are certain English assessments which we're talking about earlier, so all the components, reading, writing, speaking, we can do it at one go in a combination of online and offline. So today I'll focus, I'll not go into detail about, all the different modes of digital assessments we support, but we'll focus most probably on, remote-based assessments. So as Graham mentioned, in UK, we generally call it as remote invigilated assessments. So I basically think that there are 3 types of it, 3 types of internet-based assessments or remote-based assessments which we support. First one is kind of, self-proctoring. Self-proctoring is something which is very much famous for low-stake examinations. And Matt mentioned some example where, people were allowed to do exams in Brunel University with open book. So for those kind of assessments, you need some basic level of proctoring where the candidate system is locked down, but so that he cannot use certain other applications in his device. So he does not have access to certain other websites. But other than that, you're not capturing the candidate and you're not applying any kind of logic using artificial intelligence, machine learning to find whether the candidate is cheating or not. Then comes second level, which is human proctoring. And it has been the most famous way of proctoring, which we have seen in the recent times. So here, candidate can take exam anywhere, but he's always being proctored or invigilated, the UK term, by invigilator. And there are different ratios, based on the level of examination, if it's a very high stake assessment, you can go with 1:1 proctor ratio, or if it is not highest stake examination, you can go ahead with 1:5 or 1:10 invigilator ratio. And in this kind of proctoring, what we do is that there is an invigilator who is able to look at all the candidates live. He's able to send certain messages. He's able to communicate on certain parameters with all these people, as well as take certain actions that, if he feels that there's something incorrect going on, then he can stop the examination, or he can pause the examinations, controls like that. The third mode, which is dual proctoring, and which we support as well as recommend to all our customers, is this mode, dual proctoring, because we combine everything in this mode. Definitely, we want that from security perspective, the candidate's machine should be completely locked down. He should not have access to any other applications. We also want that a human proctor should be looking at what is going on, but still there are chances of bias or many other things, or chances of a human missing out certain things. And then what we did is that we use certain parameters of parameters based on which machine can actually capture and tell that whether the candidate is cheating or not. We have started with few things which you can see are mentioned over here, in which you can see whether multiple people are present, the same person is not present, or there are certain checks on movements of the candidates, their eye movements, voice detection, things like that. And there are many other things in which in these things what happens is that there are flags raised by the system today, and it is available to the human proctors that see something wrong has happened during this particular duration, and then the human proctor has the capability to actually lock the examination or move forward, or many other things which can be done. So these are the three different modes, and based on the budget of customers, based on the type of assessments which you're going through, it's low stake or high stake assessments. Some of the things which Graham mentioned, it's an option to all our customers that they can decide on which of the modes. Other than this, few key risks which I wanted to talk about was which we can actually solve before the examination starts. So, when we started working specifically with our customers in the last 3 months on remote invigilation or remote proctored assessments, few things, these are few problems which have faced at scale. Like, there's the system configuration is not as required to conduct this examination. The bandwidth of internet is quite low, because of which there's trouble either at the proctor or invigilator side, or either at the candidate side. Then the browser version does not allow the assessment to open, or it doesn't allow certain things of proctoring or invigilations to happen. And there are certain options that the students today, they are very tech savvy, and they can play around with your system and find out ways that they can still cheat, they can still put in certain softwares in the system which causes using which they can do certain kind of malpractices. What we felt that these kind of problems or these risks, these can be solved before the examination itself. So we have started something called as infrastructure readiness check, which we call as IRC, where first of all what we do is that we check the entire system, for the browser things, for certain things which I mentioned previously, that whether someone has tried to put in some new kind of software, things like that. And this entire infrastructure readiness check we do in a window, or we give candidates a window of 2 weeks before the examination, that during these 2 weeks you can do this particular checks in your system. Our help desk is always available, and they can connect with the help desk anytime during these 14 days and get their system ready. Second important thing which we do is data quality check. So this is also very important, because during the examination, lot of data from the candidate machine will pass on to the proctors, or a lot of data would be required for certain checks which we want to implement using machine learning, artificial intelligence. So we do want to check that all this data is coming to us without any kind of antivirus software blocking it, or any kind of firewall in the system blocking it. So those kind of checks. And we also understand that the experience of candidate is of paramount importance. So the candidate should definitely have a look and feel. They should definitely go through a dry run check before the examination, where they see that how the system will, what all things the system will capture from remote proctoring perspective, what all, how will the assessment console look to them, what will happen after submitting certain things, what are the things which they can do, if they face certain issues. So definitely, to give that kind of experience, we have involved or we have put in exam dry run check as a process. And after implementing these three things, infrastructure readiness, data quality, exam dry run check, we felt that before the exam itself, we have been able to solve 99% of the issues which any candidate has been facing. So that is why we talked a lot. We talk a lot about the different ways or different functionalities which are available. But this process is also something which we have seen with our existing set of customers, which has helped us to mitigate certain kind of risks. Before I end about remote assessments, I also wanted to talk about that what we are thinking in future for this. And we know that in these particular times, once I start the examination, high speed internet, it is very much required to conduct any kind of remote assessments. And if there are things like power failures, or if my internet speed is low, or somehow on the day of examination my device it gets updated and it's out of configuration, then the student or the candidates who are coming for the examination, they lose their only chance. And even if one candidate is not able to complete that kind of assessment, we do feel that remote proctored assessment is not inclusive. And this is only because of internet, because internet is inevitable. It is very much required for conducting these kind of assessments. So our purpose or our vision for the future was that we want to make this remote proctored assessments or remote invigilated assessments completely inclusive. And to do this, we know that we want to will have to put internet out of the equation. And this is what we are working on, that we want to do remote assessment with proctoring without any internet. And said that we do not want to compromise anything on security. So in addition to the software or the solutions which we are talking about, we have also created our own technology, our own set of hardware, which we call as TCS Ion paper device. And using this particular device today, we have the capability to conduct offline assessments. And now we have come up with the capability to conduct remote assessments without internet. So this is something, very quickly I wanted to cover about remote assessments. Definitely, there are many things or details to talk about, but in this particular time, I thought I'll just give a brief introduction. And the way Graham also mentioned, the way we work with any of our customers or talk with any of our prospects is that we definitely first understand the nature of their assessments, and then we provide a solution which first of all meets their pain points, solves their pain points, as well as it is scalable, so that anything like COVID comes in future, they do not need to worry in case of scalability. The solution should be very much affordable, so at the best price possible, or matching the budget, you would say. Best experience for every stakeholder, most probably the student. They should feel at home or at ease while using this. Security is a major thing, regarding the brand impact and the trust impact which it can create if we fail. And one very important thing is technology agnostic. So all the solutions which we make, we have a big research team, and we continuously invest from our own side, and all the latest technologies which are coming into market, may it be artificial intelligence, may it be machine learning, we continuously invest and find out that how it can help us to make the assessments more secure, make it more easy for the end users to use, and we completely do that. So talking about what we have done till date, if I talk about India, I did mention at the start the numbers, like we have conducted more than 210 million assessments. If you talk about India, every family is connected with TCS Ion. We have multiple solutions. TCS Ion digital assessment, we talked a bit about it, where every high stake, more than 90% high stake examinations in India, may it be an admission test, recruitment test, all those kind of assessments, they are done through Ion platform. All the high stake pen paper based examinations for schools, for universities, they are conducted. They are marked through a digital learning platform, digital marking platform. There are some other platforms like Digital Campus, which is kind of a student information system, which we call in UK, which is covers a lot of institutes in India. There are digital learning platforms also which we have created, which touches life of every small school-going children. There are certain products for people who are seeking job, who are already in job, and upskilling. So we have seen that we touched every family in India, and now we aspire to touch the lives of every family in UK. So yeah, that's it. What I wanted to talk about today. And if you want to connect with me or talk more about our services at TCS Ion, or how we can help you in remote proctoring space, as well as many other areas related to assessment and learning, we will share this presentation, as well as I'll share my contact details with you, so that we can get
Thank you, Nikhil. Yeah, thank you. I'm sure the presentation would have already addressed some of the questions that our audience would have had around remote proctoring. I see that we've run 15 minutes ahead of what we'd already scheduled. But what I'm going to do is quickly summarize some of the questions that I see in the comment section, and I will try and address it to our speakers who I think are best suited to answer them. But that should not stop others from adding on to it. So one of the questions that I see here is around remote proctoring. And while we see that remote proctoring could be an answer for assessments where the candidate count maybe is small, what about high stake and large volume exams like say GCSEs or the SATs? Graham, would you want to take that question on? Do you think remote proctoring is the answer for high stake, large volume exams?
To bring me in the plea. Hello, everybody. So thanks for giving me the easy question, Smita. I'm grateful for that. I think the question here really relates to what's fit for purpose. And in the environment where GCSEs and SATs operate, it's probably not at the moment because of the scale. It does relate to another question that crops up a little bit later about the influence of remote proctoring and online tests. And I think in this environment with national assessments, there probably has to be some change in the way that those assessments are formulated and delivered before we can start moving into much larger scale delivery. As it stands at the moment, it's probably not viable. That's a short answer.
Can I add to that, Smita? Do you mind?
Yes, Matt, please.
And I think you're right, Graham. It's about changing the way that we approach the assessment to make it more scalable, rather than having, many thousands of people trying to sit the assessment on the same time on the same day, which is always going to be difficult to do remotely. It's about trying to find different ways of approaching the assessment. That said, the one example I see from around the world in terms of quite I think a trailblazing project is what's happening in Egypt, where the Egypt government have invested heavily in taking their high stakes school leaving exams into a digital environment. So getting rid of paper and everybody using digital devices to do that. Now, of course, they are all sitting in exam halls still. But during the COVID crisis, they were able to pivot some of those assessments to be remote, so that the ones that were really critical to happen could happen, a bit like the OU model that I mentioned as well. So I think that's a glimmer of hope. It's a sign that some of the governments around the world are starting to recognise that they need to digitally enable more of the assessments to give greater flexibility.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think that also leads to the other question that we have here in the comment section around that. Today, we don't see a lot of encouragement from the government on moving to remote proctoring. So what do you think should be done from our perspective to be able to get that kind of buy-in and acceptability from the key stakeholders?
So shall I have a crack at answering that first?
Yes.
Everyone else is being quiet. It is a difficult one. There's no doubt. And I think part of the problem, certainly here in the UK, it's slightly different reasons in other parts of the world, is that our education system is so tightly integrated with, and the policies that sit around it so tightly integrated with the political landscape. And the political landscape is ever changing, whether it's within the same party, getting different education secretaries coming in, or whether it's wholesale change in parties. And no one ever really wants to do the same as the last person. They want to introduce change, not change necessarily for change's sake, although in some examples that's the case. But it's very difficult to build consistent change in a particular direction when you've got so many variables moving all of the time. So until you address that and get the policymakers to be more consistent about their approach, I think it's difficult. But again, the glimmer of light, I think if I go back to what I was mentioning about the SARS outbreak in 2003 in the Far East, that brought about some political change in the way that education was done from schools through to universities, because everyone saw that there was significant impact in normal business. And hopefully that's going to be one of the silver linings of the COVID crisis, is that it's going to be more transparently obvious to policymakers that the current models don't work. And that, of course, will apply right around the world because it's been a pandemic that's affected everybody.
Yeah, definitely, Matt, I completely agree with you. A crisis like this, it adds up, and government would definitely be looking at, some good implementations, which you mentioned, and things like that. One, important thing is, from technology perspective, is that technology is also evolving in this particular remote assessment space. In the last 3 months, it has evolved to a great higher level. But there is some more work which needs to be done here. And that said, it will also help. And right now, when COVID-19 kind of crisis ends, we have time to prepare. Even in center-based assessments, I think, which government promotes for GCSEs, A-levels, there is a chance that you put in remote invigilation also. It will only add up to the overall security level, which is present there. So there will be human invigilators there, but in addition to that, there can be machine or remote proctoring also put in place, which will further reduce the chances. And with these kind of implementation, it opens up the way also. If you see that machine proctoring is able to capture certain things which was not being captured, through remote invigilators and center-based assessment, definitely it will lead to way, and it will help technology also to evolve, because we would also know more that how we can exactly mimic what was happening in center-based assessment to remote assessment.
So I have a particular view about this, and that is that people who make the change just get on and do it. If you look at the response to COVID-19 and the need in the UK for more ventilators, what happened? Production companies switched their production lines within the matter of days to creating ventilators. I look at the history of online scanning and marking of scripts with a company that I used to be with. Well, we invested money in putting that in place. We started it, and now, hey ho, 15 years later, it's ubiquitous. People don't think twice about it. And I think that the more that people take this up in different areas, and the more normal it becomes, albeit not necessarily in the K-12 sector and the national testing, the more it's going to influence that. So I just think it behoves us to support those who are using this technology and to get on and do it ourselves, because ultimately it will then permeate into the other parts of the education system.
Yes, thanks, Dan, for adding to that, and Nikhil and Matt. One quick last question. It talks about feedback data being stored. So, Nikhil, if you would want to take that, I think that question is around how would these feedback to the individual candidates be shared, and where it is stored, and those aspects from a technology perspective.
Okay, perfect. So, there are different rules actually for each and every country. Specifically, if we talk about UK, we do have to comply with GDPR regulations for any kind of data. We have to take certain consent, and it should be within UK boundaries, and we should be very clear about the approach, or the way we are utilizing the data which we are capturing. We should be very much open and transparent to the people. That's why we are capturing this kind of data. So these all things we definitely take care of. In UK, if I answer specifically, yes, we store all the data in UK.
Excellent, thank you. I think it has been amazing listening to all our speakers today, and also through some of the questions that we have gone through. And I'm sure participants will also agree with me that they have found it really useful. In case any of the participants have any questions or would like to know any further details on what we have discussed, please do connect with us, and we'll be happy to help you pivot your assessments for 2020 and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.